got somebody here that does plenty funky fusion. Prominent figure in the movement that became known as jazz fusion. And I want to say good afternoon to Mr. Jeff Lorber. How you doing today?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me on your show.
Tell me something. You got started. How did you basically get things off the ground, as far as your music career goes?
Well, I got it off the ground. I was living in Portland, Oregon, and there was a nice little music scene there. There were some good musicians there for a small town, and previous to that, I went to Berklee College of Music, so I had sort of learned a little bit about arranging and songwriting, and anyway, so I got involved in the music scene in Portland, and I started my group, the Jeff Lorber Fusion, and then we were lucky enough to get a little recording contract and eventually signed with Arista Records. We made 6 records for them, and I've been sort of busy making records and writing and touring and doing that ever since.
Now, one of the more prominent members of somebody in the sideman in the band was Kenny G.
Yeah, Kenny was in the band for about 5 years, and we toured around together. And before he started his own career, which I actually helped him do his demos that got him his record deal, and worked on a couple of his records too early on.
Now, and besides him, who were some of the other regular members of the band at that time?
Well, the original, there really were quite a few different permutations, but the band that sort of stayed together for the longest time and made a number of records together was a quartet that featured Kenny, myself, and Dennis Bradford on drums and Danny Wilson on bass.
Okay, and do you think the music that we came to know as fusion, was there a difference, and the reason why I asked that in talking with people like Billy Cobham, George Duke, and what have you, in their view, they tended to have the idea that on the different coasts or in different parts of the country, fusion meant different things, or the approach to it was different.
Well, I think really every musician has a unique expression, and George Duke and Billy Cobham are 2 brilliant, musicians that have really contributed a great deal. I think we're all, I don't know how much truth there is to that in a way, because of the fact that we're all kind of listening to the same music. When the Weather Report record came out, I think everybody really paid attention, and people heard, Grover Washington music, and people heard that, and Earth, Wind, and Fire, and Tower Power, and, the early incarnations of Chick Corea and John McLaughlin, and there was just so much great music being made, and everybody was listening to all of it. Now, I will say that in general, there tends to be, East Coast or New York musicians tend to be maybe a little more aggressive than West Coast musicians. They have a little bit more of more of an aggressive approach to the way they play and the way they attack rhythm. But I don't. In a way, I don't think it's particularly regional. Although there are some great musicians from all over. From almost every city. Chicago has been a great music town. Detroit, of course, and the state of Ohio, in particular, in the '80s, there was just a lot of great funk music that came out of that state. So I guess, in a way, it sort of heats up in different places, and in some ways that probably does have an effect. Okay,
so what made you decide? Okay, and after a while, you basically dropped the fusion name off of the title of the group or the title of your productions. Did you do a little more experimentation, or?
Well, at some point, like a lot of things do, when things get real popular, it just kind of runs its course. And I sort of felt like I was being a little bit limited by that name of Jeff Lorber Fusion. But later on, just recently, it seemed like it was sort of the opposite, that the idea of calling the band the Jeff Lorber Fusion seemed like a great idea, and sort of bringing back the idea of fusion jazz, of music that's more ambitious and more jazzy. That seemed like a really good idea. So for the last 2 records, I brought back the name Jeff Lorber Fusion. I've been sort of proudly calling what I do fusion music once again.
Do you? I was going to ask if you see a resurgence. What with Return to Forever having come back together in a manner of speak, Stanley Clarke, even with more, so many other groups. You yourself. Because I know on the Now Is the Time you brought out some weather report on there. Do you think there's a...
Yeah, that's right. We did a weather report cover. Yeah, I just think, for some reason it just seems like it's time to kind of bring back some of that kind of music, and once again, it seems, fresh and vital and interesting, I think.
Who would you say was a huge influence on you as far as the keyboard, playing the piano?
Well, certainly Chick Corea and Herbie Hancock, those are two of the finest jazz piano players out there, and more recently I've become a big fan of Keith Jarrett, who I also really admire. But, the first guy that I really listened to that I could sort of really understand what he was doing and really learn sort of directly just by listening to him a lot about music was Horace Silver. And there's a new song on the new album, the Galaxy album, that's called Horace, that's dedicated to Horace Silver, and it has some of his sort of funky, chromatic, bluesy lick incorporated into the melody of that song.
And again, this is Barry Jackson, your Fusion Funk Meister here at 90.1 FM KKFI. And talking with keyboardist extraordinaire Jeff Lorber. And who have you heard that you think you may have influenced? Who's listening to you and who's pretty much grasping that concept of jazz, or your concept of jazz?
Well, I don't know if it's up for me to say that. I mean, I think, I like to think that I've contributed something to jazz and to contemporary jazz. But I don't know. I can't really answer that one, I don't think.
Okay, fair enough. Now, I didn't mean to put you on the spot like that, but
I think there's a lot of great music out there, and I think we're all listening to the same stuff to an extent, and so we're all kind of influenced from one another, quite a bit.
Okay, now who out there are you doing any producing with? I understand you have your own studio.
Yeah, well, my last two records that of my own records, I work with Jimmy Haslip, and I really like working with Jimmy, and he's a great talent, the bass player that used to be with the Yellow Jackets. And, we work on quite a few projects. One record that I did that's done very well was the last Richard Elliott record. I co-produced and co-wrote the whole record with Richard, and he's just a great player, and that was a lot of fun to work with him.
Yeah, he's been here. He's been here with Kansas City's own Norman Brown.
Yeah,
on more than one occasion. And
yeah, I've had a chance to work with Norman. He's a great talent too.
Oh yeah, well then that's somebody we have in common. So, well, let me ask you this. We talked briefly about that, your latest CD, Galaxy, and what can we expect from that as it relates to your approach?
Well, the last two records were really they're similar in that I wrote a bunch of new music that could be classified as fusion jazz, and also I redid some of my favorite songs from earlier in my career, but I sort of reinterpreted these songs with some of LA's finest session players. We were lucky to get Vinnie Colaiuta on bass, and of course Eric Marienthal he's sort of part of the group as much as possible. He tours with us quite often. We have the pictures of Eric and Jimmy kind of on the cover, kind of representing the Jeff Lorber Fusion as being the three of us, and we play together as much as we can, although everybody's kind of busy, so I'm not always able to get those guys to play with me. I have to work with other guys too. But we have some great guitar players on the record, Michael Thompson and Paul Jackson Jr., as well as a guy named Larry Coryell, who's a great jazz player. And I played a little guitar on the record too. I played a little guitar, just simple parts. And Lenny Castro on percussion. And I was able to get half the record was mixed by a guy named Michael Brower, who won Engineer of the Year for the last 2 years at the Grammys for doing. He's famous for doing more pop records. He mixed Coldplay and John Mayer. But I've been a fan of his because he used to work with Luther Vandross in this group called Change back in the '80s. I was a big fan of his, so I kind of contacted him and talked him into mixing half of my record, that was a lot of fun to work with him.
Okay, now the all-important question my listeners, have been asking: when are you coming to Kansas City? Yeah, well, the minute I'm invited, I would love to come. It's been too long. It's been way too long. I remember in the '80s we used to play there quite often. Yeah, it's been too many years since I played in Kansas City. Well, I tell you what, we're definitely looking forward to that, and and to my listeners again, my name is Barry Jackson. This is the 90.1 FM, KKFI, and been talking here with keyboardist, producer, and I don't know how many other hats he's wearing, but Jeff Lorber. And it's been a lot of fun. It's been interesting. It's been educational. And well, one more thing. Are you doing any teaching?
Any teaching?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I have a couple of students, some piano students, and I'm sort of, this is a long-term project, but I'm kind of working on a book that includes a lot of information about harmony and jazz improvisation and some insights into the recording process and producing. And I'm not sure what I'm going to do with that, because that's just sort of been on the back burner for quite some time now. But yeah, I enjoy. I give like master classes occasionally, and so I like kind of spreading what I've learned to the next generation. And I really encourage people to introduce their children and the younger generation to jazz and get them involved and get them to learn an instrument, because I think it's important to keep the music alive.
Well, I tell you what, I sure want to thank you for taking some time out, and again, want to thank Jeff Lorber for speaking with my listeners, and there's not a few of them here in Kansas City, believe me. A lot of conversation about what's been happening with you, and not only your current projects, but your entire discography. So again, thank you very much for taking the time out, and hopefully we get to see you. All right, you take care.
All right, thanks.
Bye.